welcome. I'm Esther Martinez, a sewing and pattern making instructor and the designer behind Looks and DIY. Today I'm going to show you how to sew the Noelia dress. It has a fitted bodice and a naturally flared skirt designed to make you feel elegant at any special occasion. It's my personal reinterpretation of the classic Qipao, also called the cheongsam. I kept its essence by preserving the characteristic neckline that defines this timeless style. I also kept the frog knot buttons as a classic decorative detail. I combined them with an invisible side zipper for greater comfort. The spectacular flare of the skirt comes from the French seam at the side. The gathered, lined sleeves balance the whole design. They add a romantic, sophisticated touch that balances the whole design. The final result is a cocktail dress with lots of personality. You can find all the details about materials, sizing, cutting, and other specifications in the pattern instructions PDF. The dress includes 4 different print sizes of the pattern. These sizes are A0, A4, A3, and US letter. If you do not have the pattern yet, you can find the link below. The link is in the description box under this video. That is where you can buy the pattern. Now, let's enjoy sewing together. Let's sew. We will start the dress at the back. Here is the center back, and here is one of the sides. We are going to sew French seams on every seam. This gives the inside a fully clean, polished finish. To do this, first place the pieces wrong sides together. Start by matching the waist notch on both pieces. Pin the pieces together at that notch. As you work upward, you will find another notch. Match those notches as well. Along the curve up to the shoulder, you will find another notch. Match that notch too. Match the shoulder edges as well. Moving down from the waist notch, you will find a small notch along the skirt flare. Match it on both pieces. Finally, match the hem at the bottom of the skirt. Once all the notches are matched, we are ready to pin the seam. Place pins all along the entire seam. Once the seam is pinned in place, we are ready to sew. The pattern includes a 1.5 cm seam allowance for French seams. This gives you enough width for both steps of the French seam. We'll stitch both steps using that seam allowance as our guide. If you know French seams, use this option. Sew the first pass at 1 cm. Then trim it so the final seam becomes a very narrow 0.5 cm. This creates a very fine finish. If you are new to French seams, use this second option. Sew the first pass at 0.7 cm. This matches the width of a standard presser foot. Then, sew the second pass at 0.7 cm as well. This leaves a little more seam allowance to handle. You'll find it easier to sew using this technique. Choose the option that best matches your skill level. Either approach will give you a clean result. Now, let us go to the sewing machine. After the first seam is sewn, trim it down to leave about 2 mm of fabric. Leave as little fabric as possible and retrim later if any section is still too wide. Do this trimming along the entire seam. To prepare for the next step, press the seam with an iron. Press on the inside, pushing the seam allowance to one side. Keep pressing so the seam rolls fully to the edge. This removes thread tension and helps the seam lie flat. This way, the final French seam will look very clean. This is how the first step of the French seam looks on the right side. We sew the second step on the wrong side. On the wrong side, use your fingers to work the seam right out to the edge. Make sure the seam sits exactly on the edge with no fabric peeking out. You can also achieve this by pressing carefully in the previous step. Once it is positioned, place a pin. Repeat this all along the seam. Once it is pinned, you can press and then stitch the second pass by machine. Sew at 0.5 centimeter or 0.7 centimeters, depending on your choice. You can also baste it by hand, as I am doing here. Hand basting helps me relax and gives me a cleaner result. I did not used to do it, but now I love this sewing moment. In this case, it makes the seam much more precise. It helps us get an even more polished and perfect finish. With each stitch, you can nudge the seam fully to the edge. Insert the needle tip and gently push the seam into place. This keeps the seam perfectly aligned as you baste. This way, you can make sure the result is completely perfect. After the seam is sewn and the basting thread is removed, press it to one side. I have already sewn the back. As you can see, I have both sides joined together. This is how the French seam looks once it is pressed. It has a very fine finish, which makes it look very dressy. It is a polished piece with clean, refined finishes. Now we repeat the same process on the front. Here are the 3 front pieces. This is the center front piece. This is the right front piece. This is the left front piece. As you can see, these pieces are asymmetrical. Even so, they are assembled the same way as the back. Each piece has positioning notches to guide you. We'll sew French seams here as well. The only tricky part may be the asymmetrical area on the right side. Work slowly. That shape can feel a little awkward at first, but the notches will guide you through it. Use the positioning notches to place the pieces correctly. There is extra fabric here by design, and we will trim it off later. At the yellow pin, both notches are aligned. Match the notches and then align the pieces to the end. Keep the excess at the top, just like this. This is the correct way to position the pieces for sewing. At the waist, place the pieces back to back and pin them again. As you can see, it is the same type of sewing. Only the shape of the piece is different. Do not let this triangle intimidate you. We will cut it later after the neckline French seam is finished. Now we are going to sew French seams on both front side seams. Here is the front side seam joined. As you can see, it is already finished. I have already pressed the French seams. They look beautiful with a very clean and polished finish. Now we are going to place the front and back together to sew the shoulders. Place right sides together and align the French seam at the shoulder on both the front and the back. Pin the shoulder first and then pin the neckline. On the other side, we have piece number 4. Piece number 4 creates the neckline asymmetry. We follow the same process on this side. Place right sides together and start at the shoulder. This side does not have a French seam because it is a single piece. Put the back shoulder French seam toward the side just as you pressed it. Once everything is aligned, sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. This pattern includes a 1 cm seam allowance. The shoulder seams are sewn with a 1 cm seam allowance. Now we are going to press the seam open. We have several options for finishing this seam allowance. One option is to fold it inward by ½ cm to mimic a French seam finish. This creates an even, clean finish along the raw edge. You can also finish it with a zigzag stitch or an overlock stitch. I do not like that option because I want to keep an invisible finish. To do the folded finish, we press it first to make the fabric easier to handle. Pressing helps you take it to the machine and keep it from shifting. Fold the fabric inward, bringing it right up to the seam. With small hand basting stitches, make sure to catch both layers. Use the basting stitches to keep the fold stable as you sew. Once it is basted, stitch close to the folded edge to hold it in place. Stitch only through the seam allowance on both sides. Once the stitching is finished, press the seam open again. The shoulder seam is finished. As you can see, it looks beautiful either way. Now we are going to sew the side seam that is not asymmetrical. In this area, we do not sew the French seam yet, and we sew the opposite side instead. We sew it the same way as before. For you, this step is already done in 3, 2, 1. The French seam is finished. This is how it looks on the inside. Now we are going to sew the collar of the dress. To make the Mandarin collar, we need 2 fabric pieces. One of the collar pieces is interfaced. This piece is interfaced, so it feels firmer and holds its shape as you handle it. The other piece is not interfaced, and it will be the inner collar. This gives the collar more structure and stability and helps it stand up. That is why I chose a medium weight fabric. If your fabric is very lightweight, use firmer interfacing or interface both collar pieces so it stays straight. Otherwise, you will not get the typical Mandarin collar shape for this neckline. Now we are going to place the collar right sides together. We will start with the outer collar, which is the interfaced piece. On the collar, you will find 3 notches. The center notch marks the center back. Place the outer collar right sides together with the neckline edge. The side notches mark the shoulder points. Finally, align the collar corners with the ends of the neckline. Do the same alignment on both sides. Here, the 1 cm mark indicates the neckline seam allowance. Once you have these 5 points marked, place pins all along the neckline. Make sure the collar edge stays evenly aligned with the neckline as you pin. Sew 0.5 centimeter inside the seam allowance. This creates a first seam to hold the collar in place. This makes it easier to attach the next layer. Remember to keep the shoulder seam pressed open. Once the outer collar is sewn, we move on to attaching the inner collar. We are going to sew this collar differently than a shirt collar. Once this seam is sewn, the collar pieces will sit with wrong sides facing each other. We do it this way because we will finish the neckline with bias tape. This makes the neckline look clean both on the outside and on the inside. Just like before, locate the center notch on the collar. Place the right side of the collar against the wrong side of the dress. Pin the center notch first. Then pin at the shoulder points. Finally, pin the collar ends. Place pins all along the entire seam, just as before. If you want to add a label at the neckline, now is the time. Now, let's sew. This seam includes a 1 cm seam allowance. To shape the neckline and help the curve lie flat, make small clips along the neckline. This helps the curve sit flat and smooth. After clipping, press again. Press so the seam allowance turns toward the collar. Pin both neckline edges in place. Trim the small excess areas from the inner seam allowance to smooth the curve. Do this on both sides. If the French seam at the asymmetrical neckline does not match perfectly, adjust it. Make both sides line up evenly. This is what it should look like. This way, you get a smooth, even curve. Now, we are going to join the two collars to make it easier to attach the bias tape. Sew a straight stitch along the collar edge from seam to seam. This stitch is only to hold everything in place. It's time to attach the bias tape to the asymmetrical neckline. This cut will stand out and become a beautiful detail against the floral fabric. This is a detail I really love. To start, open the bias tape. Place it right at the edge of the neckline. Secure it in place with pins. Do not stretch the bias tape and simply ease it into the seam. Remember to keep the French seam turned to the side. When you reach the corner, bring the bias tape upward. Form a small triangle and pin the bias tape to the side. There will be a fold here, but it will be hidden by a button at the front. Continue shaping the neckline with the bias tape. When you reach the end of the piece, cut the bias tape. Then sew it in place. Stitch right along the first fold of the bias tape. Sew all along the neckline. Now that the bias tape is machine stitched, it is attached to the dress. Next, we will sew a slip stitch on the wrong side. This way, when we fold the bias tape, the stitches are not visible on the outside. This gives us a very professional finish. Fold the seam allowance upward. Then, fold the bias tape over. Insert the needle inside the bias tape. The knot keeps the thread from pulling out. Take a small straight stitch, catching only a few threads of fabric. As you can see, we pick up very little fabric with each stitch. The stitch is not visible on the outside. Then, pass the needle back inside the bias tape. Move forward about half a centimeter. Then, repeat the stitch. This is how it looks on the inside. On the outside, the stitches are invisible. I have now finished the hand stitching on the bias tape. As you can see, it looks beautiful and very clean. It gives the neckline a very polished finish. Nothing shows on the outside because we only catch a few threads of fabric. I had to unpick a small section to insert the label. I did not realize I had not added it yet, and it was something I really wanted. In the tutorial, I showed you when to add it. Now we are going to continue with the remaining side seam. This seam is slightly different because the neckline is symmetrical here. We are also going to add an invisible zipper so the dress is easier to put on and take off. First, locate the waist notch. Start by holding the waist notch. From there, measure 11 centimeters. At that point, mark 1.5 centimeters for the seam allowance. This mark will serve as our guide. I mark it with a pin so you can see it clearly on camera, catching both layers. This is what it should look like. For the first pass of the French seam, stitch at 1 centimeter. This way, after turning, the final seam ends up at 0.5 centimeter. It should look like this. The finish changes slightly when we switch from a French seam to an invisible zipper. That is why I want to emphasize this step. Keep marking the 1 centimeter seam allowance where we will stitch by machine. Instead of ending with a straight line, sew a small curve. Sew it just as I am showing you. Stop sewing at the 1.5 centimeter mark and keep that point in mind. Stitch at 1 centimeter and finish right at that point with a small curve. This is the first step of our French seam. Now make a cut exactly at the 11 centimeter mark. Make this cut straight because mine did not turn out perfectly straight. Make sure you cut in a straight line. After making the cut, trim down the seam allowance just as we did before. Now turn the piece and sew the final step of the French seam. Here you can see the small curve we stitched. Here is the cut we made. Do not finish the seam at the end of the cut. Instead, sew 1 centimeter higher than the end of the cut. This means the second step of the French seam ends 1 centimeter above. This will make it easier to sew the invisible zipper later. Next, press and mark the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance for the invisible zipper. Do this by measuring 1.5 centimeters. Let's move on to the invisible zipper. Place the invisible zipper right sides together with the fabric. Align it so the plastic stopper sits flush with the bias tape. One of the key moments in making the Noelia dress is sewing the invisible zipper. The technique we are going to use is explained in detail in my book, The Zipperpedia. The book also includes 8 other essential zipper techniques for professional results. If you want a clean, professional finish, this technique is essential. It makes the zipper practically disappear into the seam. To master it step by step, you can check Chapter 5 of the Zipperpedia. In this chapter on the invisible zipper, I show you all the key details. I explain how to prepare the garment and the trick for keeping the teeth hidden. All the techniques are explained step by step. They are illustrated with more than 300 photos, so you do not miss a thing. I am sure you will notice a real improvement in your projects once you apply these methods. You can get the Zipperpedia at looksanddiy.com. You will also find the link in the description box below. I'm sure this book will be your best sewing ally. Now, we place the zipper on the opposite side. To do this, I recommend keeping the zipper closed. It should be closed like this. Align it at the end and secure it in place so it does not move. This will ensure the zipper stays perfectly parallel and does not shift. We are doing this only to hold it in position. Place a few pins along the back seam allowance. Once it is well positioned and straight, you can open it. This is the position we need in order to sew it. As you can see, the zipper does not reach the very end of the back. This is intentional, so it is not a problem. This is where the zipper ends, and it is aligned because of how we positioned it. Now, sew it the same way as we did on the other side. Once the zipper is attached on both sides, we join the inner front piece for the asymmetrical neckline. To do this, move to the back and place the inner piece and the back right sides together. Align the armhole edge and the seam allowance so they sit flush. For the upper fabric band, fold it downward on the diagonal. Then, finish securing the piece in place. Sew with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Be careful not to catch the zipper teeth. To keep the inside of the dress fully consistent, we will cover the zipper seam. We will use bias tape as a finish over the seam we just sewed. The first thing we do is trim the zipper. You do not need to cut it flush. Leave a few extra centimeters so the zipper does not pull at the hip. This gives the zipper a slightly softer finish. Trim the excess bias tape left from sewing the seam. Repeat this on the other side, just as you did on the upper fabric band. I have already secured it with a green pin. As you can see, I have folded it downward on the diagonal. At the zipper corner, form a neat corner with the bias tape. Fold the bias tape over itself and secure it with a pin. Do the same on the other side, keeping the fold in the same direction. When you reach the end, do not cut the bias tape flush. Leave about 1.5 centimeters beyond the end. Once it is positioned, stitch by machine along the edge of the bias tape. Catch both layers as you stitch. To finish the zipper end, fold the remaining bias tape inward. Fold it inward to hide the raw edge neatly. This is what the fold should look like. Secure the folded end with a pin. Then, top stitch from the outside. This holds the zipper in place and keeps the bias tape hidden. Now it is time to sew the sleeves. Place the sleeve pieces right sides together and sew the underarm seam. Sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. As you can see, I already have one sleeve sewn and pressed. Repeat this for all 4 sleeve pieces. Sew at 1 cm and press the seam allowance open. Once the seam is sewn and pressed, we will sew the gathering lines. Set the stitch length to the longest setting and lower the tension. This makes it easy to pull the threads and gather the fabric. Do not backstitch at the beginning or the end. We want the threads to stay loose. Sew a straight line from the sleeve seam up to this point. At the sleeve cap, do not gather the section between the seam and the notches. Leave this section ungathered on both the front and the back. The back notches are marked with a double cut. With that in mind, we can begin sewing the gathering lines. I will sew the first gathering line at 0.7 cm. This distance matches the width of my presser foot. The second gathering line, I use this presser foot that gives me a width of 0.5 cm. This helps me sew quickly because I always know my distance from the edge. Sew a line parallel to the first one. Do not change the tension or stitch length. You should now have 2 parallel gathering lines. Now, we need to fit the larger sleeve to the smaller one. Gently pull only the top 2 threads or only the bottom 2 threads. Reduce the fabric little by little until the pieces match. Go slowly so you do not break the gathering threads. If you pull too hard, the threads can snap. Once the sleeve hem is gathered, compare it with the hem of the short sleeve. This is what we are going to do now. First, locate the notch that marks the center of the sleeve hem. This notch helps you center the sleeve correctly when attaching it to the short sleeve. If the fabric is heavily gathered and you cannot see it, locate the sleeve cap notch instead. The hem notch is directly below the sleeve cap notch. There is one very important detail to keep in mind. On the outer sleeve, this notch corresponds to the back. The short sleeve piece is the lining. If the outer sleeve notch marks the back on one side, the lining notch must be on the opposite side. The notches must be mirrored because the pieces will be sewn wrong sides together. This will make more sense once we place the pieces together. Keep this detail in mind as you align the pieces. This will help you avoid mistakes when you sew the layers together. Otherwise, you may need to unpick it later. On the outer sleeve, you will see a double notch. This double notch marks the back. On the lining sleeve, the single notch marks the front. Once that is clear, we place the pieces right sides together. The first thing we do is match the sleeve seam. Carefully, without catching the gathering threads, we align both seams. This notch marks the center of the sleeve. We match it with the one we marked earlier with a pin. Once the sleeve is fully inserted, we check how the gathering looks. We adjust the gathers until they look even. In this case, I left the outer sleeve slightly smaller than the inner one, so I needed to redistribute the gathers a bit. I did this until both layers matched. Once it fits properly, make sure the gathers are even. They should not be more concentrated in some areas than in others. If the gathers are not even, the sleeve will look irregular. Once you are happy with the gathering, secure it with pins. Since this side is already adjusted to size, I tie a knot at the end of the threads. This prevents the gathers from loosening. It also lets me distribute the gathers all the way to the end. This is a small trick I really recommend. It is fine if it takes you a few tries. What matters is that the sleeve turns out right. On the other side, we repeat the same process. Once the gathers are evenly distributed along the entire sleeve, we sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. This pattern includes a 1 cm seam allowance. If you made the gathering lines at the measurements I mentioned, they will not show on the outside. This is because they sit inside the seam allowance. That is because we stitched them at 0.5 cm and 0.7 cm. This places them below the 1 cm seam. Now we press the seam so it goes toward the sleeve. Be careful not to press the gathers. We only press the seam allowance. You need to be very careful here. If you flatten the gathers, the outer sleeve will not look as nice. Now we place the seams together and make sure they match. Check that the seam alignment is correct before you continue. We also match the armhole notches. Here are the double notches that mark the back on both the lining sleeve and the outer sleeve. Now we locate the front notch. Here is the front notch. Once everything is aligned, we mark the sleeve cap. Gathering the sleeve cap can be a bit trickier at first. This is the moment to start pulling the threads. Choose whether you want to pull the 2 top threads or the 2 bottom threads. Always stick to the same pair of threads. Now, let us check that the measurement we left is correct. Now, we do the other side. Once the gathers match the size of the lining sleeve cap, we distribute them evenly. We spread the gathers evenly along the sleeve cap. Keep in mind that it can look nice to have a bit more gathering at the top. Place those extra gathers where the sleeve cap marking is. That helps the sleeve cap keep a prettier shape. Once the sleeve is ready, we attach it to the dress. With the sleeve right side out and the dress wrong side out, we place them together. We let the side seam fall toward the back. Using the same pin that was holding both seams before, we secure it here as well. Now, we locate the armhole notches. Here are the 2 back notches. Here is the front notch. We align the sleeve cap notch with the shoulder seam. Finally, using the same pins, we pin together both sleeve layers and the dress. Make sure each pin catches all the layers. Once everything is pinned, we sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. If you like, you can hand baste this seam first. This way, you do not have to manage 3 layers at once. This can help you feel more confident at the sewing machine. I personally like to hand baste sleeves so they turn out perfect. This pattern includes a 1 cm seam allowance. As you can see, the sleeves turned out beautifully. I love the effect this pattern creates. At this stage, we are going to do the final finishing steps. To finish the seam we just sewed, we will cover the inside with bias tape. Stitch the bias tape in place the same way as on the other sleeve. This gives the inside of the garment a very clean, consistent finish. It matches the finish we used on the zipper and around the neckline. Since there are many layers here, bias tape is the best option. Finally, we just have to do the hand stitching. We'll hand sew the traditional Qipao frog knot buttons. These are the typical buttons used for this type of dress. We are going to use 2 of them. One button goes at the base of the neckline. Place it right where the facing meets the outer layer. The other button is aligned with the side seam. For both buttons, center the decorative knot. Place the decorative knot right on the bias tape. Do the same placement for the second button. To sew them, I recommend using doubled thread. Tie a knot at the end and hide it inside the button. Make sure the round detail sits exactly at the center of the bias tape. Then sew with small, neat stitches. I have already sewn the buttons and both of them are attached. For the neckline button, use this seam to anchor the thread. Anchor the thread here so it stays secure. This helps keep the stitches hidden. This way, nothing shows on the outside. For the second button, use the side seam line to follow the design. I recommend doing the next step only after trying the dress on. That way, you can adjust it and get a perfect fit. That is why I suggest sewing only the first part of the button first. Then try the dress on. Hold it in place with a pin. After that, sew it permanently. This keeps everything comfortable and well aligned. Lastly, I added a few invisible snaps in this area. As you can see, they are barely noticeable. They help keep the sleeve from separating. Sew them with small invisible stitches and doubled thread. From the outside, nothing shows at all. On the inside piece, you can see the matching hooks. These hooks help keep the piece securely in place. Once you have finished the seams, you can move on to the hem. Let's start by folding the hem of the dress. We are going to make a very narrow hem. To achieve this thin hem, we will do it in 2 steps. The first step is to press a 1 cm fold with the iron. Press this fold all the way around the skirt hem. Mark the fold carefully with the iron. Once this pressing is done, stitch the hem right along the edge. I stitched it about 2 mm from the edge using a compensating presser foot. This helps you stitch very precisely and parallel to the pressed fold. After this first line of stitching, the hem will look like this. Now we trim the excess fabric right along the stitching. After trimming, fold the fabric again along the stitched edge. Fold it right along the stitching line to keep the hem narrow. It should look just like this. On the inside, you will still see the first line of stitching we made. At this point, you have 2 options. You can hold the fold in place like this as you sew. As you stitch, remove the pins one by one. This works better than pinning perpendicular to the needle. Pinning perpendicular to the needle does not work well here. The fabric is very fine and delicate, so the pins can shift. Another option is to hand baste it first. This gives you a very narrow hem. It also stays perfectly aligned with all the seams of the dress. Once all these details are sewn, your Noelia dress is complete. This is the final result of the Noelia dress. I hope you enjoyed the process and sewing along with me. I would truly love to see the result of your Noelia dress. You can share a photo with your review. I'm sure your picture will motivate and inspire many more women to start sewing their own clothes. I will be waiting for you at Looks and DIY for your next sewing adventure. I am sending you a big hug.